So he says here, I know that you think that if you can just make enough money, your problems will go away and there will be harmony in your household and your relationships will be better. Unfortunately, that is not how it works. What actually happens is this. All right, well, welcome to the Money Alchemist podcast. I'm Brent Gargano.
And I'm Ben Jones.
And this has now been, I think this is officially our 26th episode.
That is right.
So we do this every 2 weeks. So just like anybody that gets paid bi-weekly, there are 26 paychecks in a year, 26 episodes. This is officially a year.
Yes, it is. We had a couple rough first starts that I don't think we counted in our episode number. Poor Anthony Lewis, he joined us right as we were launching the podcast. We were completely unprepared. I remember it. We didn't even know how, or when I say me, I didn't even know how to hook up a third mic. You remember that?
Now we've got all of those.
And we shared our first recording. We actually had a shared mic setup, which is so. Think back at that now, man. We've come a long way, and we're going to be adding video this year. That is on the agenda. Of course, I've gotten bombarded with a lot of stuff at the beginning of the year. Not the least of which is the move. But then we've got our, other business initiatives that are piling up. So it's definitely on the back burner for now, but we'll get it done.
No, I demand that we have it figured out. But anyway, we are so happy that you listen. We hope that you find some value in this. Again, I know I've said this before, but we'd like to continue to listen to feedback and drive the podcast, how you guys are trying to, based on what you want to get out of it. So if you guys like more guests versus more of a banter from Ben and Brent, we are receptive to that and certainly would welcome your feedback. Ben, is there an email address that listeners can submit feedback to?
Yeah, so you can actually find our email information, our contact information in the show notes. But I would say for episode ideas, just general feedback, send it directly to myself and my admin. That would be planning, PLANNING at nwmgadvisors.com. So again, that's planning at nwmgadvisors.com. Any feedback is valued, even critical feedback.
And so last time that we were here, we had a discussion around property and casualty insurance on a personal level. We may revisit that for businesses in time, but today we wanted to come back to more of our kind of normal shtick here and talk a little bit about money and emotion. As advisors, I know I've said this before, but when you start out as an advisor, there's so much that you can do to save taxes and improve a plan. But as you mature in coaching clients, you start to really think about the impact that you're making on their life. And you start to ask, like, what's the more valuable part of what I'm doing? Is it, doing this Roth conversion to save some taxes, or is it enabling this person to do something or make a choice in their life that they may not have made otherwise. And it is really, as the advisor, it's just so special to be able to witness that. And so we become, as you develop as an advisor, you start to be at least somewhat reflective on like how wealthy people start to internalize that wealth and what that actually does. Because there's so many people in the world that they kind of see wealth through this lens of social media or through the lens of maybe a friend that's come into some money. But very few times do you really get into that person's mind. Mm-hmm. And us as advisors, I really think we have one of the coolest jobs in the sense that we get to learn about the psyche of that person and ask some of those tricky questions.
Yeah. So what most people get is the Facebook version of what, of how someone experiences their lives, financially speaking. You think about all the stuff the vacations you do, the new house that you buy, the new car that you buy, every photograph that you put out to the public, if you're a sensible person, it's going to be positive. It's going to have a positive tilt to it. It's also just because of the visual nature of social media, it tends to have a materialistic tilt. Because it's a lot easier to take a picture of a thing than it is, an emotion or a feeling, or even just a value. Like how do you photograph a value and put it on social media? So social media just generally has a materialistic tilt to it. But when you sit down with someone and you talk about their motivations, their family, not just not just the opportunities, but the challenges, then you get a totally different picture of what wealth is. It's not just some number on a statement. It's actually complicated. I got a good kind of a prompt for additional conversation is, I constantly, one of my addictions is scrolling X. I'm constantly doing that and reading in my free time. And it really is like junk food. It's pseudo information. But one thing that I came across, which really stuck with me a couple of days ago, was I think it was this account called Macro Trends, or it might have been Unusual Whales. I forget. I think it's Macro Trends. Stated, said breaking. Everything's breaking, by the way. Breaking. The millennials now consider the wealthy to be someone who has a net worth of at least 2.5 million. So that's what equals wealth. Wealthy, I mean, is you, in order to be wealthy, you have to have $2.5 million.
Which I guess 2.5 million is the new million, just because, I mean, based on inflation, money's roughly lost half of its value since 2000. So over the last 25 years, a million what was a million in 2000 is now 2 million. So I guess it's just an inflation adjusted number. Is that it?
Yeah. Well, remember when we were kids, and even to this day, when you said, "Oh, so-and-so is a millionaire," you would think, "Oh man, that they've made it. They've hit the big time, and they can do so much with that money. They can buy a Ferrari. They can, buy that grand house in that nice neighborhood that has gates on it." But nowadays, it's funny. It's like you still hear that term millionaire, and it conjures up like images of fantasy. You're like, wow, that person's made it. But in reality, to sustain the pretty like middle class standard of living today, now you can get by without $1 million. I'm going to be clear about that. But to sustain the middle class standard of living, and when I define middle class, that means like if you're used to an income of like $200,000 a year, isn't
it crazy that sounds like middle? I don't know that that's actually middle class or not. But.
That's upper middle class, I would say.
Okay.
But to sustain that, $1 million is a minimum. That is a minimum amount that you need to have saved up. Ideally, more than that. But the term millionaire is it doesn't
have the same weight that it used to.
Not in reality, but in terms of psychological meaning, it has a lot of weight still.
What's the term for like? I have $5 million or $10 million. Is
there
like a new term? So you're just still a millionaire. Multi-millionaire.
Yeah.
So now it's just a multi-millionaire instead of a millionaire.
So the new millionaire is the multi-millionaire.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you one of we both coalesced, and as advisors, we follow a lot of other advisors with respect to our social media and what have you. And there was a post by a fairly notorious financial advisor out of New York, Josh Brown, that got the two of us talking a little bit about this. And I wanted to introduce this post for our listeners because I think it's just a different take. Okay. So I'm quoting this from the post here, and we can look at, he has, let's see how many, 5 points that we can spend a little bit of time on. So he says, I know that you think that if you can just make enough money, your problems will go away and there will be harmony in your household and your relationships will be better. Unfortunately, that is not how it works. What actually happens is this. And now we have our 5 bullet points. So the first one, minor problems become magnified until they are major problems. So small things that you wouldn't ordinarily be worried about when you were before you had money now become big things, because now you don't have some of those bigger. It's like, isn't it funny that as humans, we just seem to want to find things to be frustrated about? Like, do you remember being in class in college and there was always that kid that just had like something to say about the test and why like it was unfair?
Yeah.
Right. Like human nature is to find things to be frustrated with. Right. There's like a level of just like, if you are the kind of person that likes to take problem with something, even if you remove some of those foundational, more meaningful problems, like the lack of money, because that can be a big problem. Like, turns out you actually still find problems to focus on. It's actually maybe it's about your personality.
Yep, that's right. I hate to admit this, Brent, but I kind of was that guy.
I know you are, because you talk about it for the CFP.
Cynic. Yeah, it's true. Golly. But I used to be a lot worse. I hate to admit. So I've had to train myself away from this like negativity. I don't know what I was born with that gave me this outlook, but I tend to be kind of a cynic. And so I would criticize the test and everything and say how things are unfair. And, but the thing is, like, I get over it and I just move forward.
You know what I was told as a kid? Life's not fair. Right.
That's right.
And there's some level of acceptance to that. And I think there's probably a lot of like core, motifs through this where it's like, look, the world is kind of screwed up. Your life with money or without money is going to come with problems. There's going to be annoyances. There's going to be challenges. Right. And so a lot of this is just about like coming to terms with the fact that like, yes, it's not fair. Right. And that kind of is a hard reality, I think, for a lot of people to.
Oh, for sure.
Think about.
And so when you think of in terms of like wealth accumulation, in order to be wealthy, I think people equate wealth to happiness. The more wealth, the happier you are. And and it flows into that term that I think people are naturally skeptical of, which money can't buy happiness. You hear that all the time. And I also hear rebuttals to that, which are quite funny as well. Of course it can buy happiness. Well, I think happiness is also a temporary state. What money can't buy is meaning. Pursuit of wealth for wealth in and of itself is not a goal that is going to create a meaningful outcome.
Right. I think one of the things in my life, so I have a cousin who, when we were kids, it was so obvious. Like, he was the 10-year-old that asked for an HTML coding book for his birthday. His parents didn't like that he, was up past bedtime. So he would hide under his covers with a flashlight and taught himself to code HTML. Okay. Like, ridiculously smart from when we were kids. And we were the two eldest, grandchildren on my mom's side of the family. And it was just so obvious from the beginning, like, this guy was going to be super successful. And, lo and behold, here we are in our mid 30s. And yes, turns out he's super successful. And so it's one of the things that I observed as I got this interesting second seat to kind of watch this was nothing that he ever did. Like, if you ever asked him what drove him as a kid, like, it was never, I want to make a bunch of money. He actually, when we were 12 years old, he got into buying and selling domain names for websites. And that went to, I'm going to develop a website. By the time we were 14, he had developed and sold a website for like $50,000. We were 14-year-olds. He had 50 grand in his bank. Never once did he set out to make money. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And so as I've developed my career and I've become an advisor, like, I thought, to me, it was really important, like, do something. And we're fortunate that, like, telling people about their money or helping people make monetary decisions. I mean, the advice that we give and the thoughts that we had, it can be worth, millions of dollars. So it's fortunately a very economically productive thing, but a lot of times doing something or and we've had this conversation before on the podcast, but working for the sake of like accomplishing something or the meaning in it can sometimes drive the money.
Yeah. So,
but back to this post. Well, do you have something to say?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking it was really interesting that what drove that person was some sort of internal mission. I'd be curious to know, what that mission was. I think it was just genuine curiosity.
Genuine curiosity.
Was what drove him. And then, that curiosity happened to coalesce into economic benefit for him. Now, I would say in our world, this field attracts a lot of what you call schemers.
Oh yes.
I love and schemers can be found everywhere. And schemers are folks who this is the general term we use to describe the people that are chasing the dollar. They're trying to game the system in order to create quick and easy profit for themselves. So they're trying to short circuit or shortcut natural growth and natural progress as a human being. They're basically saying like let's take this individual that you had as an example. Like he wasn't trying to like buy and sell domains just for a quick profit. He was probably really curious, like how it worked.
Right.
Like, how does this work? How does this put together? Like, what can I do with it? So there's that motivation. There's the motivation like, okay, I'm going to buy this domain and I'm going to resell. Here's an example, because I just transferred our company's domains to Cloudflare. So I'm working with our IT people to move from Squarespace to Cloudflare. And I had these domains. I was like, they're about to renew. I said, what rather than dealing with the transfer, why don't we just let them expire and then we can just renew them at Cloudflare? They said, oh, no, don't do that. And I was like, why? It says, as soon as they expire, someone's going to buy them, or someone's going to have a bot that's not going to buy them. They're going to book them. And they're going to try to resell them to you at a higher price. And it's instantaneous. So apparently there are grifters in cyberspace that wait for domains to expire. And then they have these bots that immediately book those domains. And then they try to resell them to you. That's a scheme. It's a scam, if you ask me. But, this kind of behavior, I don't think drives a meaningful life. I imagine that the people that do that, they may think that they're probably living pretty materialistic lives and they think that they're happy, but they're also, there's got to be a sense of emptiness that goes along with that. So, and back in our world, like there's a lot of advice professionals that are schemers, and they're not looking to necessarily drive a meaningful outcome for clients. They're just trying to gain some close proximity to to money, and through that gives them the ability to manipulate. And I think it doesn't happen super often, but you still see it, and you get these situations like Bernie Madoff, for example. He's the most famous, and also Ponzi scheme. Artists. These are folks that don't have meaningful careers, or essentially, they're
greedy.
Yeah,
it's called greed.
Yeah, they're.
So, so back to like, okay, what does wealth do? Like, what are some of the nuances? So you can get, if you tend to be a person that has problems with things. Guess what? You'll find problems in new things. Kind of going through the other points in this post, your friends and acquaintances, it's, your social circles change. If you come into money, and I imagine there are a lot of young people that are going through this because millennials are becoming significantly wealthier than we had been in the past. As you come into money, it influences the way that your social circle perceives you. Right. And your friends can change, your acquaintances can change. The way that you think about who's in your circle changes and why they're there. And so you said this before we got on here. We were talking about you had a YouTuber that you were talking about. And So I think he go ahead and tell the story.
Yeah. So it was very interesting, and it kind of this happened on the same day where I read that that post on X saying that millennials now think 2.5 million is the is the marker that that delineates between the poor and the not poor. And this fella, he's a YouTuber I watch. I'm not going to name any names because he's a little bit controversial, but I do like to watch him. And it's well known that he makes at least 10 million a year, just streaming, on YouTube. And, he gives like, a lot of it has to do with like video games, but he also gives political commentary and just like pop culture commentary. But he was reminiscing about his upbringing. He grew up very poor. They're not called food stamps, but it's called some other. It's a card. What is that called? ECB or something like that.
A WIC card?
Is it the WIC card? Okay,
I don't know.
Well, they were on like a government food supplementation program. But he had his buddies that would come over and play video games. He had his mom.
EBT.
Yeah, that's okay. That's it. So, but they had no money in the bank. But he said he was reminiscing, and he went, like, you could see him just light up talking about these times. He brought up old videos and showed him and his buddies, all having a good time. And he made the comment. He said, that was the wealthiest I've ever been. Because fast forward to today, he's in his, mid to late 30s. I don't know exactly how old he is, but he's not far off from my age. But, his mom is since, deceased, and he lives on his own. And he had, all his friends are married, and, he's not married, and he's still single as far as I know. But it just was an interesting observation that he's financially wealthier than he's ever been today. But then he doesn't consider himself being wealthy. He considers that, back what I had when I was in my, teens and early 20s, I was wealthier then.
And I think you had mentioned before that he had even mentioned that he felt that his relationships were more genuine before, and now
he didn't mention that. I just suspect that to be the case. So when you have a ton of money like that, so let's say you are a well-known wealthy individual. There's some people that are wealthy and people don't know that they're wealthy. That's what you want to be. You want to basically be incognito wealthy. But let's say you
stealth
wealth. Yeah, that's the best place to be. But a lot of these YouTuber people, they can't, everybody knows how much they make. Yeah. And you can calculate how much they make. So what I suspect is that these folks that are well known to be wealthy, and this is not exclusive to YouTubers, this could be anybody that is like if you're a CEO of a major corporation, you have to constantly be suspect of anybody who's approaching you to establish a relationship, because there are so many people that would not do, and they wouldn't lift a finger if it weren't going to benefit them economically in some way. And you have to think like, okay, is this authentic? Is this act of kindness, or is this outreach? Is this relationship initiative? Is this authentic? Is it truly for me, or is it to get into my pocket?
And that's tough and sad, right? Because you want to be able to connect with people and have like we'll talk a little bit later on like what
makes you
drives.
So lonely.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about. There's some stats and some data around like what actually drives happiness and real wealth, and it's not. I mean, certainly the lack of money is an issue, but there is a point where it becomes. Money is not the means. It's it's not the ends. It's the means to the ends.
Yeah. And I have a feeling like some people will listen to this and they'll think, oh, woe is them. Poor little them. They got $10 million a year, boo hoo. It's like, do not discount the value of your relationships. I never, ever in my life would I give up my relationships, authentic relationships, for $10 million a year. Never. And you think, oh, that person, they got no problems in the world because they've got all this money. I'm going to say, no, I would not trade my life for theirs. Now that's assuming, now you can have a lot of wealth and have authentic relationships too. So I'm not saying that the two, are they can't be had together, but I'm just saying that, it's easy to discount that problem when you when you have not truly taken into account the value of the authentic relationships that you have.
And so we've kind of talked through. So there's some source reference material for this. We've referenced that post. There's also a couple of authors that have written, and I think we've talked about these in the podcast before, but there's a book by Daniel Crosby called The Soul of Wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ben and I are both involved in our local financial planning association, which is great. It's a financial planning association is a national organization dedicated to the education and bettering of financial advisors. So we have events that we put on through the year, and one of those events, Daniel Crosby came to talk about his book, and I thought he had an interesting framework for, what actually drives wealth. And he had a framework that he called the PERMA framework. So PERMA is an acronym, and it stands for positive emotion,
mm-hmm.
which is fun, right? Which that seems to be the one that everybody wants to focus on for happiness, right? Everybody wants to have fun. Like if I could just not work and ride a boat all day long, I must be happy, right?
Yeah.
So that seems obvious. Then you've got engagement, which is really, the way that the note I have here is that engagement is deep work, but I don't know that it has to be paid work. It just needs to be being engaged in something is meaningful. Relationships, we've just been talking about this one. So relationships with people and having connection to people, having a meaning that's bigger than yourself. That's another, that's the M. And then advancement, the ability to grow and advance, as soon as you stop, advancing yourself, you kind of begin this slow process of fading away. And I think that, again, back to the point, it's not that you don't need some money to be happy, because I would say on average, we've talked about financial anxiety versus financial stress. Financial stress is challenging,
mm-hmm.
And it can drive problems. So I don't want to minimize that, but with more money, the adage is more money, more problems. I don't know if it's more money, more problems, but maybe more money, different problems.
Yeah, that's right.
And problems, it's so easy to judge how good or bad or hard or not hard your problems are compared to somebody else. But problems and challenges in life are so individual.
Well, it's not even useful to compare. It's not. I think it's not futile, but it's a waste of time to try to put yourself. I guess in terms of perspective, it's valuable because you can find someone that's really having a bad go at things and then relate your life to theirs. And in that way, it kind of helps in a way it's a little bit uplifting, because you don't look at your situation as negatively. But in general, I don't think it's possible for us to truly be empathetic, objectively empathetic, where, we can accurately describe how low our problems are, or great our problems are relative to other people's. I think we generally think that our problems are worse than others. Brent, I had a hard day today. You have no idea how hard it is. You can't relate. And it's well, actually you probably can. So, but I think it's kind of a waste of time to do that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, you get to, so what are some things related to
mm-hmm.
our profession? I found some other points in his discussion. So to be wealthy, you need to have that PERMA framework. And as we're talking to clients, we're thinking about, how is this person, especially when it comes to retiring,
mm-hmm.
there's so many people that say, I don't want to work and I want to retire. And so much of our job is figuring out okay, I get that you don't want to work, but what do you want to do? And what does being engaged and purposeful in retirement or whatever that looks like mean?
Yeah.
But I found some other data points interesting here, which was okay, so how does that then relate to a financial planner, and how does financial planning influence your ability to be successful in these areas? And something that we've talked about, we had a podcast recently on goals. We both hate the idea of the term goals, but when you have a financial plan, the study shows, and this is again from Daniel Crosby's research, but when you have a financial plan in place, a written plan, even if it's not perfectly right, but it articulates some of the things that, hey, I'd love to send my kids to college one day and I'd like to buy a house, or whatever the goal, the planned expenses are, that statistically people that have that in place are 15% wealthier and 10% less likely or 10 times less likely to panic and sell out in a market downturn.
Mm-hmm.
So, back to happiness.
Well, it kind of ties into the whole PERMA state, that ties into the positive emotions. So, I was listening to, Andrew Huberman. He's got the Huberman Labs podcast, really good stuff. But he had a guest on that was talking about, and I forget who it was, but he's talking about just like having a positive outlook on things changes your environment. Actually, it changes your outcome too. So if you have a financial goal, it could be a physical fitness goal, just any goal, like that in and of itself is a positive thing, because it implies nobody's goal is to say, okay, I'd like to destroy my wealth, or like, I'd like to burn down my house. People, when they have a goal, it's generally like a progressive goal, meaning that you want to take yourself from one position and then like +1,
right.
or +2 or whatever. So, just having a goal is playing into that whole positive emotion reinforcement.
Well, and I think just tying in a little, we also talked ahead of this. One of my favorite quotes is kind of as a negative quote. I don't love how negative this quote is, but I think it is real. So Charlie Munger, the late Charlie Munger, says the first rule of a happy life is low expectations. And I don't love that he says low expectations. I think one of the really important things, and as an advisor, again, like my job isn't necessarily managing you away from a market. Like markets go down. Volatility is part of investing. My job is helping manage expectations up front, right? Help you visualize and go through the mental exercises of a downturn or whatever it is, so that when you get there, you're kind of living consistently with the expectations that have been set, and what's going on, and things fit in your framework.
What is disappointment? It's a negative emotion. So, by what Charlie Munger says, while it's kind of viewed at, no one likes to have low expectations. That's something, it sounds like a negative, but it actually isn't in this context. What he's basically saying is, the way I interpret it, is have realistic expectations. Because if you're constantly disappointing yourself, let's say, my goal is, I want to be a high jumper, and I want to jump 50 feet. I'm never going to be there, so I'm constantly going to be disappointed. And that cycle of disappointment can only spiral into some sort of like existential crisis. So you need to have something that is actually achievable. Now, it needs to be slightly out of reach, like slightly out of your skill set. So you need to challenge yourself to some extent. You don't want it to be like, so, if again, the high jump analogy, it can't be like, well, I want to jump over this 12-inch ruler.
Well, you just need to have a realistic approach. Like somebody back to the financial plan. Okay. Like the concept of, I want to retire with $10 million. It's very easy to say when you're 25 years old and you're just starting out. Right. So then you have to work backwards to, okay, that's great. I think that's an awesome goal, right? You want to jump 50 feet over the high jump. Fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about what the reality is of the steps to help you get there and how. So again, it's not about, I don't think it's about, no, you can't jump 50 feet. I think it's about having realistic or inline expectations with what's going on and a process to revisit those expectations. And this is where I think the plan is so valuable because, when I'm working with clients and we're revisiting their financial plan on a regular basis, part of the goal is helping kind of remind them around, here are the plans that we've put in place. Here's the spending trajectory. Here is why we're doing what we're doing. And I believe that part of the value add of that is that as they progress through life, they kind of have an idea of what to expect.
Yeah. And that's challenging today. So back into expectations. So another question that this article that you brought up, Morgan Housel, who wrote the CNBC article in the show notes, also posed like kind of a question, does the world run on envy? And I think that when it comes to managing expectations today, it's never been more challenging because we're just bombarded with these images of wealth. It also ties into like, how money is handled. Our fiat system is a little bit broken in the sense that it's unmoored from a stable value placeholder. So what we get is a Cantillon effect where the ultra wealthy who are closer to the money spigot get to enjoy that money before inflation occurs, and they also get a lion's share of the money. And then if you want, I'm not going to go too down this path because it's somewhat convoluted. It's a whole podcast in and of itself. But the point I'll make is that since COVID, the top 1% of wealth holders in the U.S. have seen something like actually I have the stat pulled up here. Bear with me for a second.
And while you're pulling,
no, I have it right here. Just give me a second. They've had their wealth increased by a total of 15 trillion, whereas the bottom 50% have only had their wealth increased by 3 trillion. Now everybody's positive, but some are a lot more positive than others. As George Orwell's Animal Farm says, some animals are created more equal than others.
Well, and in Morgan Housel's book, he talks about, there's so many people that reminisce about the 1950s, like the mid 20th century, and how happy people were. And he points out that like in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't so much of a wealth gap. You also didn't have an easy way. Like if you didn't live in the wealthiest part of society, you didn't see that.
Yeah.
Now the 1% has access to a cell phone and Correct. It can show up on your social media feed.
Yeah. And so you've got a massive wealth gap. And then you've got an unprecedented historical amount of visibility when it comes to the wealth gap. So, you've got a lot of people really, really zeroing in on this idea that money comes easy because they see it and it looks like it comes easy. And for some people it does, honestly. I'll say that the longer I work in finance, the more I realize like the more money you have, the easier it is to make more money.
Oh, there's no question.
But
that's just compounding.
But as you said, the world isn't equal. We still need to realize that and manage our expectations. So just because some celebrity or some self-employed entrepreneur like tech bro has billions of dollars and they're buying all the material stuff that you want, doesn't mean that you should have the expectation that's what you need. In fact, as Daniel Crosby points out in his PERMA framework, it's actually pretty well documented that that's not what you need. If what you're aiming for is a meaningful life, you need, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and advancement. So you can have all the capital in the world. So if you're just chasing after wealth for the sake of wealth, you're not going to end up.
By the time you have it, you've forgotten about those things.
Yeah, well, you're gonna get there, and you're gonna realize, oh, that's not what I want. This is not what I thought it was going to be. So you need to have a kind of like a diet. Can't just be McDonald's all the time, or I'm picking too much of McDonald's. They get too much.
I'm going to pick on a friend of mine that I recently talked to. So this is literally a buddy of mine. And we were on the phone the other day and he told me all in the same phone call. He said, I want to retire at 45.
Mm-hmm.
I believe strong. I am all about passive income, I think was his quote. And then he proceeded to tell me that he set up a business a couple of years ago, and he got it up to the point where it was making $15,000 of profit per week. Okay. So he's profiting $60,000 plus a month, and he's got the business operating on its own. So he's just kind of handling the phone calls and everybody else is doing the work. And he said, Brent, I got to the point where I was able to wake up at 11 o'clock in the morning and do whatever I wanted for the day. And I got so bored that I went back and got myself a W-2 job. So now he's running the business, but also has a W-2 job that he's working with the bit. And I said, how ironic is it that in the same conversation you told me that you want to retire at 45, that you believe in passive income, and then when you finally actually had passive income, you were so bored that you couldn't stand it. So you went back and got the W-2 job that I remember talking to him years ago. He was saying, I just can't stand this W-2 stuff. I want to be a business owner. Right now, he opted in to a W-2 job to give himself something to do.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think it's so interesting. Again, we have such a, I could go on with stories about this. I recently talked to a young person that was talking about, hey, Brent, I want to get to a spot, I don't want to work as much. I want to make some money. And I kind of finally got to a point where I said, look, I heard what you don't want to do, but I need to know what you do want to do. And I just think when you stop working, work is over, you've retired. You can build this moment up in your head for a long time. Okay, probably 30 plus years in a lot of situations. And then you do it. You sign your retirement papers, you leave your job. The next day you wake up, you turn on the news and you're sitting there eating your piece of toast and it's wonderful. And then you do it the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. And it's like, what are you doing? Right. And I think there's a big, at a certain point, it becomes like Groundhog Day and you lose that sense of meaning and time blends together. You don't know what day of the week it is, so to speak. And I just think, we've both seen this in clients that we've had go through this transition. Like, you have to be thoughtful. And I think if we're kind of summing this up, at least from my perspective, I think two of the biggest takeaways here are know yourself. Because I think if you don't have a really good sense of self and you're out there seeing these things that you compare yourself to, it's really easy to get distracted and lose your own direction. Right. And what makes you tick and what makes you happy and what's important to you is okay that it's important to you, and somebody else is okay to have different things that are important to them, like perfectly fine. You don't have to all be the same. And then thinking about like, okay, so knowing myself, what are the good works that I can do? Like, what do I want to be involved in? How do I want to manifest? Like, if I didn't have to work and I could wake up every day and watch Netflix all day, would I watch Netflix all day? What would I do with those hours? And just remember, it's really easy to say, oh, I'd love to travel the world and go out to eat. But like, again, those things
boring.
are cool.
It gets
boring. It lacks some level of meaning.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I think that, this framework around meaning, this PERMA framework is really useful. I'm sure there's other frameworks around that could be just as useful. I'll say in my anecdotal experience, just through retirement, that's kind of when I see most people who like reach financial independence and they've been chasing this goal for their whole life and it's been driving them. It's given them a lot of purpose. And then they get there and then they do exactly what your buddy did. And they retire, and then they actually go through what's called a honeymoon phase. You've probably heard this term. There's the retirement honeymoon phase where you're done. You punch your time card for the last time, and it feels like summer vacation at school. Do you remember that feeling, like getting out of school, especially in college? For me, it was like you finished that last final, and then you had nothing.
It's summer.
There was nothing. You had no responsibility. I still remember what that feels like. And I have not had that feeling since college.
And
but I can imagine that's what people feel like when they retire. And that feels great. But eventually,
by the end of summer, you were like, okay, I'm ready to go back and see my friends.
My dad had a lot of faults, but he had one wise insight into this. He said the human being is like a dragster engine. It sounds awful idling under stress. It sounds like it's about to quit. But then you put that son of a gun under stress and it does its job and it just sings. Everything kind of comes together and it's going 300 miles an hour, down the drag strip. And I thought that is a really powerful insight. Always stuck with me. I was like, man, that's actually pretty true. But people discover that. They discover that when they retire, or reach some financial independence, or they get to that like goal where they've achieved that like wealth goal that they've always had, and they realize, oh, that wasn't the final destination. In fact, I don't remember who said this, but there was a famous hedge fund manager that was interviewed, and they said, or it might not have been a hedge fund manager, but it doesn't matter. It was a really wealthy person. They said, how much money is enough? And his response was more. Because he got to that point and then he realized, oh, that wasn't my, I don't have meaning yet.
The goalpost is always out in front of you.
Well, yeah, but I think in that case, it's kind of a perverse reaction, because he got to that point and he didn't have this epiphany like, oh, wait, money isn't the meaning. He got to that point and he's like, oh, I guess I'm not there. I need to have more money to discover my meaning. So he's constantly with the irony is it's like that who is that Greek the Greek character that's constantly pushing the rock up the hill. My gosh. Anyway, he's that guy. He's never getting to the top. You're never going to reach the goal. So anyway, in order for you to reach the goal, I think you don't want to eat junk food for your whole life. You need to have a more holistic approach to your career, to your financial plans. Don't chase money for the sake of money, because it's what, Instagram Reels tells you need to be doing.
You need to know yourself. You want to make sure that you have expectations that are aligned with where you want to see yourself. They're realistic. You want to put a plan in place, and you want to find, like I've always found in my life, that it's easy to look back on the past and think, gosh, those were the days. And then you look forward and you go, those days are gone. And then inevitably, as you get into the next phase of life, you think, gosh, I didn't appreciate what was so great about the days that we were just in. Right. And there's just so much of life that's about slowing down and trying to like, hey, what is it about the season that I'm in right now that when I get into the next season, I'm going to miss? And, anyway, so I think we've beaten this concept up pretty good, but if we weren't already clear about this, happiness and money, there's a relationship. You can't, being broke and having money stress certainly leads to problems. But when you look at your neighbor or the other person that's got more money than you, don't forget that with more money comes different challenges and things like that. And we're all people, and we need to be nice to each other and recognize, one thing or another doesn't make you better or worse, money or not money.
Yeah. So to summarize, money should not be your primary motivation. It should be a positive consequence of an authentic drive. Stay away from envy. It's toxic. And it also perverts your expectations, which can lead to negative emotions. And then have realistic expectations. Don't, and I don't mean that in some sort of negative way. Push yourself, have goals that are difficult to achieve, but don't push yourself beyond your limits. And that's what you mean by know yourself, or one of the things you mean by know yourself.
Just define, if your goal isn't to, it is okay if your goal isn't to have $10 million. Okay. Your goal doesn't have to be somebody else's goal. You can live a life that's consistent with what you care about. It's just important to make sure that you don't run into that financial stress along the way. And that's where a plan comes in place, and setting something up from the get-go.
I don't think your goal should be to have $10 million. I think what you should have is a reason to collect that $10 million. Why is your goal $10 million? I think the why behind the money is more important than the money.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, we can end on that point. I think that you're right. We've beat this subject up enough. We can let it rest for a little bit. So thanks for joining us, and hope to catch you next time. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. Any company names noted herein are for educational purposes only and not an indication of trading intent or a solicitation of their products or services. Advisors associated with National Wealth Management Group may be either 1. Registered representatives with and securities offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA SIPC, and investment advisor representatives of National Wealth Management Group. Or 2. Solely investment advisor representatives of National Wealth Management Group and not affiliated with LPL Financial. Investment advice offered through National Wealth Management Group, a registered investment advisor and separate entity from LPL Financial.